Hello and welcome to another episode of the Minor Competitions podcast. Today we're joined by Ian Glasper to talk about his just released book, Silence is No Reaction, 40 Years of the Subhumans, and as well as his writing more overall, if that's okay. And it's really good to see this book up because the Subhumans are one of my favorite bands, and I think a band that somewhat oddly gets a little bit like left out of a number of sort of like histories of punk and sort of the description of musical history. Maybe we'll start with sort of that, which is sort of, so how did you come into becoming a almost a historiographer of the sort of punk scene and underground scenes? How did you back into that as something to do, Ian?
Well, I guess it primarily comes from me being involved in that scene since 1980. I got into punk when I was 13, so 1980, and it was Discharge, the band that first blew my mind. And by 1983, I was playing in bands myself, and by 1986, I was doing a fanzine called Little Things Please Little Minds. So I'd always like reading, I'd always like writing, and I also happen to like punk music a lot as well. And it was in the 90s when I started writing for Terrorizer magazine, a sort of alternative, extreme metal, hardcore type magazine. And I wrote for them for 25 years until they folded in 2018. And but also in the 90s, I started penning reviews for Record Collector, which was quite a serious sort of respected, historian type publication, which seemed to give me a little bit more credibility as a sort of punk historian, because I then started to be asked to write liner notes for sort of reissues and box sets of punk records and stuff. And eventually I just got fed up of reviewing it felt like the same book being re-released over and over again about the Sex Pistols. How many books do you need on sort of one band? People were even writing books about one gig that the Sex Pistols did. And I wanted someone to write a book about the second wave, or the third wave, if you're being pedantic, of punk that started in 1980, my wave, Discharge and Exploited and Crass. And no one seemed like they were going to do it. And that's what prompted me to write Burning Britain, that first book. So it was just a case of liking music, liking reading, liking writing, and seeing a gap on my bookshelf that I needed to fill, really.
Well, the thing I really like about that is it almost seems like getting into writing about the history of these scenes is an extension of being part of the scene rather than being something that's separate from it. And it's almost like there's a sort of a kind of mode of writing it, historicizing it, that should be part of how these disparate kinds of, chance encounters, bands, things happening, almost documents itself.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, over the years, I've been asked to write books, on things that I wasn't close to. I mean, stuff that I loved. I mean, I was once asked to write a book on the Dead Kennedys, and I was like, as much as I love the Dead Kennedys, they're my favorite American punk band. I wasn't at their early gigs. I never experienced that early sort of excitement, of that band firsthand. Whereas with the bands that I've written about, I did see them, myself, and I think that's important, to write. Because when I said someone asked me to write a book on the Great Rock and Roll Swindle, the film, I was like, I don't know enough about it. And they said, well, just Google it up. And I'm like, well, anyone could do that. To me, it's it's an important task documenting that scene, and it should be done by someone who genuinely cares about it and is, has a connection with it.
Well, check, there's kind of two different things there. One is sort of like your emotional connection to the materials, and another might be almost like a very basic question of access, in terms of like a lot of these histories, we're talking about things which these documents don't end up in like the British Library. We're talking about sort of like, flyers, ephemera stuff which maybe is in someone's attic if you ask enough people, but like, it's not the easiest to find materials.
No, for sure. It's when I did the first book, Burning Britain, that was like, I started writing it in 2002 or something. I don't know if that was pre-internet, but I can't remember using the internet when I was researching it. It was all phone calls, physical letters, even getting hold of electoral rolls and referring to, addresses on the back of records and things like that. And now it's infinitely easier. I mean, the book I'm writing at the moment, I just put a shout out on Facebook a couple of weeks ago for 12 bands that I'm trying to find, and I found 10 of them within 48 hours. It's just completely changed the playing field, really. But yeah, pre-internet, it was pretty tricky trying to track down some of those bands, hence some bands missing from the first few books that I've since caught up with, when I've revised those editions and stuff. But yeah, bands that were important that I just literally couldn't get hold of. And the other thing is when you ring a band up at the blue, ring a band member up at the blue and ask him, oh, can I interview you about your punk band from 25 years ago or whatever? A few people just said, don't take the mickey, and put the phone down on me. They thought they were being scammed, or they moved on in their life and didn't want to talk about it. So I had to try and find another ex-member who did want to talk about it.
It sounds a bit like, would you like to extend your car's warranty?
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of like call. I'm also imagining you in the late 90s going, I'm looking for Spike from Warminster. Does anyone know Spike from Warminster?
Yeah, no, that was very much the way it is, and the way it was. And like I said, the internet and Facebook's just blown it all wide open. If someone doesn't know someone from the band, they'll know someone who knew the brother of their ex-girlfriend or something, and there'll be a lead that we can follow. Having said that, there's still some bands that are impossible to track down. I've had my very best sleuths on the job looking for Social Disease from Bristol for a couple of years. Released one amazing 7-inch and then vanished without trace. And the Bristol punk scene's like really well documented. It's almost inconceivable that no one knows where these ex-members of that band are, but we'll keep on keeping on.
In a way, when we're at a point where everything is so well documented, there's actually a certain kind of mystique about having a band that can't be found.
Yeah, it's kind of like, the Loch Ness Monster. If they ever find it, it'll just be ruined. But yeah, it's quite nice when a band refuses to play Rebellion. They refuse to reform. They refuse to have their material reissued. There's pros and cons. I mean, there might be desperate fans who just dying to get that material, and they don't want to pay over the odds, sort of Discog rarities sort of prices for it. And a re-release would be nice. But it's different strokes for different folks, I guess.
One of the things I like about your writing approach across a number of books is, how to say this without seeming mean, I'm almost to say it's almost like not a writing approach, in terms of like your authorial voice tends to be not the main thing. It tends to be more how you bring together different people and conversations and string them together in a way which makes sense, more so than it being your version or your story. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, no, that's completely true. I mean, I've never liked to put words in people's mouths, and I think there's no one better placed than the bands themselves to tell the story, and I kind of facilitate it. You know, you kind of have to know the questions to ask, and you know, and then it is a huge task sometimes, especially, you know, with the Subhumans book, where you had a cast of like 50 plus characters, you know, trying to weave that into some kind of chronological order that made sense. But yeah, you know, it's a fair summation of my approach, is that I would prefer to, you know, to let the bands speak for themselves rather than paraphrase them and put my own spin on it. You know, that's the last thing I want to do. I'm kind of like, yeah, I mean, quite a few people have said, can you sign my book for me? And I'm like, well, really, you know, let's get the bands to sign it because they wrote it.
But I quite like that approach, in that it's almost like the polar opposite of you were joking about the person or who said, okay, you can write about the Great Rock and Roll Swindle, just Google it. Because you're almost like falling back on the same rehashed narratives again and again and again, and not actually going to what actually happened, how did it affect the people there, what did it mean to the people who were there.
Yeah, I try and get anecdotes that, you know, capture the mood of the, you know, the zeitgeist of the period. And yeah, I mean, it can become a little bit samey, because when you're writing a book about the 80s punk scene, you know, it's Skinhead stormed the gig and trashed it times 100. You know, if you talk to 100 bands, sort of thing. You know, there is a certain, you know, there's a sort of common theme, but every now and again you get bands that throw a different take on it, or a certain style of humor or whatnot. And all I really want to do is, with these books, is in, you know, decades to come, when we're all long gone, you know, there are documents of these bands and that scene, you know, that meant so much to people. And that's why I'm, you know, desperately trying to track down Social Disease from Bristol, for example. You know, I get the feeling that I'm probably the only person trying to track them down to include them in a book about the scene, you know. And if I don't do it, who will? You know, and when the last copy of that 7-inch vanishes into someone's attic, never to be seen again, that will be the end of that, you know, that band's sort of legacy, really.
One of the things I really like about this kind of approach, and I remember when I first read The Day the Country Died, your sort of book about history of anarcho punk, I was particularly interested in reading that, trying to understand specifically what the anarcho and anarcho punk meant to people in the scene, right? And you can have one version of it, which would be like, you know, oh, it's a very sort of, you know, an elaboration of anarchist politics coming from Bakunin and Kropotkin. And that was probably the case for a few people. But for people, there's also like, it meant getting pissed and having fun. Other people, it meant sort of, you know, particular, let's say, norms around what to wear or think. Like there's a whole range of ways that anarcho punk meant, and that varied across, you know, across the scene.
Yeah, and everybody, you know, everybody was right. You know, it was, you know, there was no right or wrong answer. You know, and that's, I mean, that book is a prime example of people missing. You know, I really would have liked to have included Vice Versa from Poison Girls. I mean, to me, that's the glaring omission from that book. But yeah, I mean, I never actually intended to separate out the bands in Burning Britain from the bands in The Day the Country Died. I was just going to write one book on the early 80s punk scene, but the book would have been huge. It would have been like 1,200 pages. No one would have been able to pick it up, let alone afford it. So they're seeing this natural divide between what you would loosely call the chaos punks and the peace punks, or I don't know, the exploited punks and the Crass conflict sort of punks. And there were certain bands that could have appeared in either book. Discharge sounded like this but had lyrics like that, so they could have, same with Chaos UK, Amoebics and bands like that. But it was just a loose way of dividing that scene in half, so those two books to me are, very much interlinked, and should be, considered together really, as and yeah, so like you said, they exploited our songs about I Believe in Anarchy, but it was literally their version of anarchy was running down the street, throwing rocks through police car windows and things like that, whereas Crass, we're talking about communal living outside, of the norm dictated by mainstream society, really. You couldn't get, further apart between those two interpretations of anarchy. So it was an interesting thing to explore.
It does remind me though of there's this one Crass flyer I particularly like, where the front side gives you instructions of how to make paint bombs, and the back side is recipes for making bread.
Yeah.
And I quite like the idea of this sort of like those two things being linked, of like, first you sort of mess up some stuff and then you go home and you bake your bread.
Yeah, yin and yang.
I also quite like, one of the things that I like about reading that book, but also this new book here, is understanding a bit the sort of difference in the sort of social times that these bands are playing. So I'll give you a real example. The first time I saw Subhumans, I think, was during their first big reunion in 1998, like toward the US again. So one thing I was struck by is I think you end up saying that the first time they eat pizza is when they're on tour in the US, is in 83 maybe. And I'm just kind of baffled by this, because I'm like, hold on a second. At this point, they're 18, 19, 20 years old. You haven't had pizza before? So it makes me realize that you're talking about a different time where there's sort of pizzerias literally everywhere.
Yeah.
And England at the time is also going to be much different. I mean, obviously, the presence of a pizza shop is not the most important thing, but it does give you kind of an idea of how that things were different.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. I mean, that time, I was 13, 14 years old when I first heard the Subhumans. So, and they're the only fast food available in a rural town was a chip shop, a fish and chip shop. And pizza was unheard of. I can remember I didn't eat garlic bread until I was 16. And then I guess that it adds a whole new depth to that Peter Kay sketch where he's talking about garlic bread being this fantastic invention, but yeah, things like that, they were exotic things, and I think Dick also says he'd never tried chilies or anything before, until the first time he went to America, and enjoying the sensation that they gave him.
I find that amazing, just because at this point, I think Dick and maybe other members of the band are vegetarians at least. So I would think they would be trying to find ways to make, I don't know, non-meat things more interesting flavor-wise. But
yeah, being a vegetarian in 1980, because that was when I went vegetarian, was when I was 13. Basically, you got served everything, but without the meat. There were no meat substitutes, and then the only meat substitutes you could get from a health food shop were things like sauce mix, which is basically a sachet of powder that you mixed with water and you made into burger shapes and sausage shapes, and it kind of tasted like smoky bacon crisps. So it was not a particularly authentic sort of meat alternative, as it were. But yeah, it was very difficult being a vegetarian then. I mean, now, 10 years ago, there would always be a vegan option on the menu, but you had to eat the vegan option because that was the only vegan thing on the menu. I mean, now there's usually 2 or 3 vegan options, and quite often there's a completely vegan restaurant, you know, in the vicinity as well. So I mean, it's incredibly easy now to be vegan, whereas, you know, I remember touring in Europe in the 80s and just living on crisps, you know, for a week and coming back really quite ill because, you know, all you could find to eat over there was sausage and cheese. You know, it was so yeah, so I guess I imagine this. In fact, in the book, I think the Subhumans talk about the instigators turning up at the studio with a box of granola, and the Subhumans were really impressed that they were proper vegetarians. You know, they were making, you know, they were making an effort and not just eating sort of beans on toast or whatever.
Yeah, I find it surprising because my understanding of the sort of various worlds they inhabited is that there was a more of a crossover than you might think if you read traditional punk narratives between, let's say, punk and sort of like, I'll call it like more hippie-ish culture. So you have the, you know, bands playing at like places like the Stonehenge festivals, right? And there's a lot of overlap between different kinds of countercultures.
Well, certainly in my neck of the woods, I live in the southwest, and you know, obviously the Subhumans live in Wiltshire, and not that far from Stonehenge and various other stone circles and things like that, you know, and there was definitely a crossover. You know, the Smart Pills were from Bath, very close to the Subhumans, and they were, you know, very much a kind of hippie punk band. There was a lot of that, which you probably wouldn't find in inner cities at that time. As time went on and that kind of crossover, you know, took off a little bit, you know, you would find them. But yeah, in a rural sort of, you know, a rural countryside upbringing, you know, there was definitely that crossover. I mean, my band Decadence Within, we called our first EP Speed Hippie, you know, and that was without really thinking about it, but it was because, you know, we were peace loving, sort of scruffy people with long hair who played sort of punk music, fast punk music.
Do you think there's part of that which is almost like a product of being outside of the major cities? And what I mean by that is, I remember when I was growing up and I was being a teenager, you know, in the 90s, and in a relatively, let's say, a medium-sized town, but still pretty small, the punk kids and the hardcore kids and the goths and the hippies all basically hung out because the scene was small enough that they didn't have enough to have independent, separate scenes. It was the one thing there was, because there's like 2 venues where they could play, so they all played there.
Yeah, definitely. We were the same. You know, the town I'm from, it's 10,000 people. You know, there was only one sort of school. You know, and you know, the enemy of your enemy was your friend, really. So, you know, the punks hung out with the skinheads and the mods, and like you said, the goths. Anybody who was considered a freak or an outsider, all sort of, you know, hung out together. Yeah, and it was only when we went to bigger towns and got chased out of town by gangs of mods or gangs of skinheads that we realised that, you know, how deep the sort of tribal rivalry ran. But yeah, the rural upbringing. I think in the Subhumans book, someone asked, I think it was Phil, why they, you know, had their pictures taken with cows. And he said because there were no graffitied alleyways to stand in where we came from. We went out in the field and stood next to the cows to have our band picture taken.
In a way, it seems kind of fitting, because if you visit Dial House, you can literally see the cows in the barn right next to it.
Yeah, Yeah, so, and I mean, and the thing is with the Subhumans is they're an honest band. They're not trying to portray themselves as anything other than what they are. You sort of take them as you find them, and they're kind of that, they're very open, honest and transparent, which was one of the reasons it was, they were such an easy band to write a book about, really.
I quite like the story about after recording Ashtray Dirt deciding never to play it again because they felt hypocritical for still smoking.
Yeah, I think Ashtray Dirt might have been written by Julian, the singer of the Stupid Humans, and might have been one of the songs that carried over. And they loved the song, like you said, and recorded it, but probably thought, yeah, we can't really keep playing it live.
So if we delve a little bit into something was into their music, one of the things that struck me about it, and I think it comes out a lot in the book, is how do I say this without being offensive? I always thought the Subhumans had a sort of another layer of sort of like musical complexity to what they were doing, not in terms of sound, like doing these sort of like like off the wall crazy parts, but like the way that their songs are structured involves things that are a bit unusual or makes shifts or changes that don't happen in a lot of punk songs. I mean, if you take something very simple like the opening bass line to No off the first album, like that's a really cool part, but I can't imagine it appearing in many other punk albums. It's quite distinctive, just the way that they sort of like build things. Does that come out of like, is that Bruce sort of channeling like prog influences, or where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head, I think. A lot of the punk bands in some of my books were influenced by punk bands. So you have this distilling of the punk sound getting more and more focused and hardcore, and Bruce was listening, like you said, to prog rock. I think they were all listening to, a wide range of eclectic sort of music. Dick was probably the most punk of them all, when I say the most punk of them all, the one that was listening most to punk. I think the other guys were listening to everything from, rock, prog, reggae, and it comes through in their music. My band, Decadence Within, I sorry to keep dragging it back to my band and stuff, but it's obviously a point of reference. But we played with them in 84 and 85, and they were at a different level of musicianship to any other band at the time. I think the Instigators say it as well in the book. The Instigators were a very musical and very capable band, but they by their own admission, they hated sound checking after the Subhumans because they made them sound so sort of primitive and simple. And the beauty of the Subhumans is they make some complex material sound quite simple as well. They were very good at playing it, so they made complex stuff sound quite easy. But when you sit down and try and work it out, you think, right, okay, where did that timing come from? So they were definitely punching above their weight musically, and a lot of that came from Bruce.
I think it's because it doesn't sort of like show off its musical complexity. It all fits together way, which just it's almost like the musical complexity is still part of the songwriting rather than being more important than it.
Yeah, I think it's in his DNA, because essentially they play punk songs, but the way they play them is that in a mature, progressive sort of way. Because some of their riffs are really quite basic, but I think it's I think it's this wider musical experience that's it's just in the delivery, it's in the arrangement, it's in subtle little bits they do, some of the transitions between parts and things like that. Yeah, and of course they were one of those bands with an amazing chemistry. So they would write 2 or 3 songs in a rehearsal, and instinctively knew what the other was going to do. And in the book they talk about how they don't have a set list that they rehearse. Most bands will have like 12 or 13 songs. They'll rehearse them up in that order, and they'll play them for 6 months, and then they'll change the set list up. They've just got a back catalogue of 80 plus songs, and it's all written down on a piece of paper, and they just pull it out and pick which songs they're going to play depending on how they feel. Sometimes they don't even look at the set list until they go on stage. So Phil might get on stage and have no idea what Bruce has put in the set list, So, I mean, I wouldn't have the nerve to do that, because I'd want to flick through it and make sure there was nothing in there that was going to catch me out, But yeah, so that, very accomplished musicians, and they brought something to the table that was uniquely theirs, really.
One of the lovely sort of side stories in the book is about the first time they played the song Susan live, and sort of finding someone who was willing to play the piano parts and come to the different performances. That's quite a nice story.
Yeah, that is a good story, and it's like you said, it's a sort of side story, because it gets introduced earlier in the book and you sort of see it come to fruition. But I was really pleased to catch up with Shannon, because he had tremendous recall about how he got into the band and how he approached them, and his preparation for it. So yes, it was great to bring that in there.
One of the things I like this sort of, let's say, more varied approach to musicality is I don't think it was just the Subhumans, but that's one of the things that I actually quite liked when I was a teenager, discovering the bands I'll call in the Crass Records orbit, right? Where, like, rather than punk seeming very one-dimensional, it was like, oh, it could involve opera singers and these weird things and these bits that I'm not even sure what the hell's going on, but it kind of works. And I think that, to me, seems like a more sort of healthy approach to keeping a genre alive, but keeping new things. Anyway, like the Discharge bands or the Dis bands were sort of punk boiled down to the absolute most minimal basics and turn up to like as high as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I get off on both aspects of it, the super intense, super focused, generic kind of punk, if it's done well with the right intensity. But yeah, also it's great to be surprised, when something twists and turns and isn't what you expect it's going to be. And you're right, I think the the Crass label, the Crass were very, I wouldn't say sort of scheming about what they put out, but they definitely had a vision, and they would take a band and they would release it, and they would put their own stamp on it as well. So the Mob, No Doves Fly Here, it's an amazing song, and it was an amazing song before Crass got their hands on it. But when Penny produced that, he did a lot of stuff to it that the band weren't expecting him to do, which was adding all those sort of layers of synths and stuff like that to make this sort of epic sort of soundscape. So I think some of those guys were a lot older than the bands that they were producing and putting out. Penny might have been twice the age of some of the bands that he was producing. They would obviously bow to his superior knowledge and experience. He was the drummer from Crass after all, so they would say, like, do whatever you want to do with it, and I think it was his vision as much as the band's vision that shaped the sound of all those releases. But when you look at that catalogue of material, you've got the Cravats and Lack of Knowledge and the Snipers and all sorts of crazy sort of interpretations of the punk thing, really. And that's really exciting.
Well, I'm gonna have to sort of make a mental note of that, because one of the things I talked with Penn about last summer Penn was telling me that he feels a little bit underappreciated for the roles he's done as a producer. And so at some point we're going to have a discussion about actually sort of what he did and how he thinks were his most important things in terms of record production, which I think could be quite interesting because I think you're right that there is a sort of important thing about sort of, how you produce music, what layers you add, even something as simple as sort of giving all those bands a sort of recognizable visual style with the circle formatting of the singles. It all gave it sort of a very sort of a coherent feel. Sometimes, if anything, maybe a little too coherent.
Yeah, and they would only release one thing by one band, wouldn't they? So they didn't want to repeat themselves, and So yeah, and I guess that circle was it was a brand, wasn't it? It was the Crass brand, really. You saw that in a record shop, you were going to buy it.
Well, the funny thing is that they first used it not for a band thing, but for a children's book design. It's on the front cover of a book called The Mystery of the Blue Tomato. And it has this sort of like circle on it and the sort of stencil fonts. And you look at this kid's book and go, is this a Crass record? It's the weirdest thing, but yeah. But cool. But one of the things I find interesting is, okay, I'm going to get this wrong, but like as the Subhumans go on, and then eventually from goes into Culture Shock and then Citizen Fish. I seem to remember there are a few points in the book where Dick talks about like he's not actually that into reggae, but it's funny that he ends up in a band which kind of like two bands. I'm going to say basically invents ska punk or.
Certainly there at the beginning of it, weren't they? I think Dick himself credits Operation Ivy with, maybe being the first ska punk band. But
okay, but it's around the same time then, yeah. And I guess it also brings out sort of something about, let's say, the Subhumans seems like their special relationship with California, which I don't entirely understand because I'm not from the West Coast. But it seems that they sort of really have a lot of good times when they're there.
Yeah, I mean, we do get into it in the book in that I mean, they're huge in America, but they're hugest in California and at the West Coast. And Dick sort of makes the point that, the further away they get from Hollywood, I guess, the smaller the audiences are. But yeah, I think a lot of that, I mean, Dick's got his own theory in the book, but I think a lot of it is basically that, they came over and played a couple of huge Golden Voice shows in the early 80s, and it just set them up with legendary status in California. I think there were other bands at the time from the UK that went over and did the same thing. GBH, the Addicts, I'm sure the Exploited would have played a Golden Voice show in the early 80s, and they're playing sort of Fender's Ballroom or whatever to thousands of people. And those thousands of people all had kids and brought them up as punks listening to Subhumans, GBH, Addicts, and Exploited as well. There's definitely, in the book they talk about how someone will turn up, and it's someone our age who was at those first gigs, but they've got their kids with them, who saw them in the 90s or the noughties or whenever, and it's almost like a generational passing of the baton, really.
Well, I'm guessing at that point, in California in the early 80s, hearing that a band from England to come to play, like let alone a punk band, would have been almost unheard of, because I'm trying to think about the logistics of trying to organize international tours. When you can't easily sort of just find venues 4,000 miles from you and just call them and arrange things. So
yeah, it's with I think it was John Loder from Southern Studios that was talking to some people in the States, probably about label stuff, and he helped facilitate them coming across. And I think the Golden Voice gigs probably financed the whole tour. You know, I think that was probably how it worked. But yeah, you're right. I mean, the thought of flying to play a gig back in the 80s, you know, was, well, it was just unheard of. You know, most of us weren't flying full stop. You know, the first time I went on a plane, you know, I was in my 20s, I think. You know, nowadays, you know, air kids were flying by the time they were 5 or 6. You know, it's a different world now, isn't it? But back then, it was, you know, so it was quite a exclusive club to be able to fly off somewhere, let alone to fly off and tour America. Most of us struggled to hire a van and get a gig in the next town.
Well, perhaps part of the West Coast thing was also, this is me speculating, but this will be a during the period where you have, let's say, bands almost like creating their own independent circuits of touring. We have bands like Black Flag who saying, we're not just going to play major cities, we're going to play lots of tiny like VFW halls and like community centers and try to get out of this sort of major metropolitan areas.
Yeah, those bands paved the way by creating a circuit, you know, and the Subhumans were part of that over here, you know, and you know, and you're right, it would have been an exotic, exciting thing for a UK band to turn up, you know, in California, the same way as it was a really exotic thing for a US band to come to the UK, you know. So you know, the likes of DOA, Dead Kennedys, you know, and stuff like that when they first came over to the UK. And you know, it was an exciting thing, because you didn't really think of, because there was no internet, you know, you almost didn't think of punk as a global phenomenon, you know, until you encountered those bands. You know, it was a local scene first and foremost. You know, your local band were your favorite band. You know, and then you travel off to another town or city and see a few other bands, and you'd start writing to some people, you know, whose addresses were on the backs of fanzines, and gradually you started networking and trading tapes and things like that, and your world started to open up. But yeah, you know, being a punk in the early 80s, it was all about, I don't know, the local disco, the local band, you know, brewing your own beer because you weren't old enough to go in the pubs.
That was one of the things I don't want to sound like I'm getting nostalgic, but I probably am, that I liked about, let's say, earlier punk releases. I'm thinking about the stuff in the 90s, where it's almost like you get the record and then it would tell you like, okay, here's the contact for the local social center, and here's the local anarchist network, and here's this. And it was just sort of like this way into part of life that I had no idea about otherwise. So the records weren't just important musically, but they're also sort of like gateways to social circuits that I would never come across.
Yeah, and also political ideology as well. But yeah, you would go to a gig and you would pick up a flyer for another gig, you know, and you think, oh, I've never heard of that venue or those bands, but it looks like a cool flyer, you know, so let's go check that out. But yeah, you would also pick up leaflets for the ALF and, you know, the Animal Liberation Front and Class War and, you know, stuff like that. And, you know, it got you reading, it got you thinking. And at the end of the day, you know, that was what it was about, really. It was stimulating some alternative questioning thought.
Yeah, which is definitely what punk should be doing, and more so than telling you exactly what you should be thinking, more so saying, here we're going to ask some questions, and here's some places you might find people who are asking similar questions.
Yeah, I mean, looking back at it, I mean, I bought hook, line, and sinker into every, you know, political ideal that was dangled in front of me by bands like Conflict and Flux and Crass and things like that. Probably naively sometimes, but you know, the one thing I took from all that was, to question everything really. Certainly everything that was put in front of you by the media. I mean, there were only 3 or 4 channels on TV back then. It wasn't death by media like it is now. But yeah, don't believe everything you read or hear on TV. But perversely, I believed everything I heard and read on Crass records. But I'm old enough now to look back and think, yeah, I kind of missed the point to an extent. But yeah, it was more than music. And you only had to set foot in one gig, and like you said, a whole world sort of opened up to you, and it was really exciting when you were sort of in your late teens.
Well, I don't want to keep you too long, so maybe I'll ask one more question as a sort of way to bring us to something like not a conclusion, but a pausing point.
Yeah.
If you were trying to frame, let's say, this sounds too little, but like the legacy and influence of the Subhumans, how would you try to explain it to people? And that could be legacy either musically, culturally, or politically, or some other way I'm not even thinking of. But like, how would you say that they have, what they've been doing is sort of carried on? Well, aside from the fact that they're still obviously playing and touring, so they're
I mean, it's a really difficult question. Because I've written like 600 pages on it, and to boil it down to a couple of sentences. But I think some big important takeaways for me, they are easily the most consistent punk band. I think I know. I've seen them over 50 times. I've never seen them play a bad gig. They've released all these records, and you can count the sort of duff tracks on the fingers of one hand. They're so consistent. I think they took the sort of excitement and intensity of punk, and they added a sense of humor, which sometimes goes under the radar, because they did have a wicked sense of humor, and really intelligent questioning lyrics. For me, they were the bridge between all the different subgenres of punk, really. The sort of anarcho punk and the sort of more chaotic, exploited kind of punk. That for me, the Subhumans were the band that anyone could like. You could easily get into them and listen to them, and just so approachable. They you could ring them up and ask them to come and play your town, and they would come and play your town. That's exactly how we got them to come and do a gig for us.
This is going to be a really nerdy question. There's this particular writing, and particularly in the liner notes, that has like a very strong serif on the ends of the letters. Whose writing is that? It's really distinctive.
Oh, that's Dick's.
Okay.
Yeah. So Dick did all the sort of writing on all the Subhumans records, and when I did, I had a label around about the turn of the millennium called Blackfish Records, and we did a tribute to the Subhumans where loads of bands covered Subhuman songs. Dick didn't want us to call it a tribute to the Subhumans because he felt that was putting them on too much of a pedestal, being the sort of modest person he is. So he made me call it the Subhumans covers album. And I asked him, I wanted him to do the track listing for the back, for that very reason that you just said. Such a distinctive style of writing, and so he did, yeah. But that's Dick's writing.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for coming along, Ian. And I really suggest that everyone goes out and gets a copy of, if not enough, Book of the Subhumans, one of your other books, which is published by, is it PM and Earth Island Books?
So PM Press in the States, Earth Island Books in the UK and Europe. That's just the Subhumans book. Prior to that, I was published by Earth Island for my previous 2 or 3 books, and then prior to that, it was Cherry Red. But you can Google me up, to paraphrase that guy from earlier. then you
Cool.
should be able to get them. And if I could just quickly plug the new book I'm writing. So I'm not sure what it's called yet, but it's going to be really obscure bands from the early 80s, bands that only did a demo or just did one EP or only appeared on a compilation album. So I'm hoping to fill in a lot of the gaps left by Burning Britain and The Day the Country Died, and create a more comprehensive sort of document of that period, because a lot of these bands only did a demo, but they were of huge importance to their local scene, and they were probably responsible for booking all the bigger bands that came through town and things like that. So I wanted to document those bands, so it's a real deep dive into that early 80s punk scene, but I think it'd be a nice complement to those first few books, and you
Cool.
won't have heard of any of the bands in it.
Sounds good, because I think you're right that even if those bands were not very well known, they were very important to holding together this kind of world they were a part of.
Yeah, I always think of it as like a tapestry, and every stitch was important, like you said, to the whole, to the integrity of the whole thing.
Cool. Okay, well, thank you very much. Come along.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure. It's nice to talk about this stuff.